Hey, how you guys doing today? Today I'm going to talk to you guys about the Sojourner Truth narrative, and I'm going to talk to you about Baldwin. Baldwin's Go Tell It on a Mountain video movie that we watched in class. First off, I'm going to start with the Sojourner Truth narrative and talk about some of the things that her and her family and the slaves had to endure as they lived in the early 19th century. And also, I'm going to talk about some of Baldwin, some of the points of Baldwin where they how they express themselves and they express themselves during church, and some of the things that James himself, the character in Go Tell It on the Mountain, had to endure with his father. And first going to start off with the Sojourner Truth narrative because I have more and I connected more to the Sojourner Truth narrative. First off, I'm going to say Sojourner, the living conditions were horrible. The text cites that she lived in a cellar where the slave master owned and which privacy was limited. Moreover, both sexes were made to be crammed into small quarters. Additionally, the quarters proved to be a detriment of health slaves. There was limited to no sunlight, therefore robbing slaves of natural nutrients and exposing to UV rays in which beneficial to the health of humans. Living quarters were damp. Slaves slept on damp boards as did the horses and other animals did that the slave master owned. The temperatures in Ulster County, New York, are famous for the all-time lows around that time in which Sojourner Truth and her family were basically slaves around that time. And the temperatures in so one could only imagine the harsh, frequent, and chill conditions that Truth had to endure, and for her damp makeshift bed. Additionally, the physicality of the quarters were sparse, and the Truth quarters were often tracked with mud and water. And the text also cites that in that area that the stench was very horrible, and it was very detrimental to their health as well as the other conditions that they had to live. And just if you could only imagine the things that they had to do because of this, like I just stated, the temperatures in that around that time were very harsh because it was the weather was very cold, and if you only think about it, the slaves, they didn't have much. And because they were basically slaves, and they were handed always the scraps and the other things that people didn't want or people didn't need, so they had to make do with what they were given. And I would like to also state that the text also cites Truth was one in the lineage of 10 or 12 offspring, with the art to live and hang an inference on the or. However, she was the youngest. She was the youngest, save one of all who were older than her, which were sold off. However, the text cites that her mother was privileged enough to be able to hold on to 6 of the children. The text also crosses into a boundary of something that I, as a reader, can relate to. And my siblings and I were initially widespread throughout a plethora of counties along a tragic mishappening with our maternal mother. Most of our mother's hairs, save one, I was able to be retained into the custody of a family member in Houston, Texas, while I was sent off to Las Vegas, Nevada. One might beg the question: how does the 21st scholar's separation from siblings and parent compare with a 19th century slave? And the answer itself is that no matter the age of the century of this disfranchisement transcends across the age and time stamps. I feel like in this text, I feel like I related to this so much because in growing up in an African American household, one thing you're always taught is that your family means everything to you, and that always respect your family and always have this relationship that your family that no one can break. And as being my brothers and sisters, as growing up to when I was born to being 10 or 12 years old. That was one of the things that I always had was my brothers and sisters, and I felt so strongly towards Truth because in this time, like my brothers, like I say, my brothers and sisters was all I had, and when I was separated from them, it was like what the hell do I do, and how the hell do I live without my brothers and my sisters? So I felt so strongly for her in this area of this text. Another thing that I kind of found was amusing, and the idea presented in the text, I found. The Truth gives how both of her parents were granted their freedom freedom from slavery because they proved to be no longer valued in truth, and that her father's limbs were no more use, and that both parents were old in age. This bit of information struck my interest in one that how dare someone try to estimate the value that someone can be put on human life, and the audacity of slave owners would have to siphon free work out of another human being and then discount their lives after work put out is just astonishing to I as a reader. In lieu of all those things, both were sent out alone the toxic shelter of slavery, which is all of the both had known, yet which all both had known to come to an end, and it closed its doors to the parent, leaving them figuratively and literally out in the cold. Finally, after one's death, a true mother, her father was passed on from family to family from from the previous slave owners, and they let him go on and on and on from house to house to house. Just I guess to show an act of kindness, but how can you show an act of kindness when you've basically ruined their lives by making them work for free? And I just felt like it's just so disgusting. What left without companionship and near the final ages of his death, his final hint of idea of Karl Marx's theory of alienation, in that he was the victim of consequences and living in a society stratified into social classes where slaves and African Americans were not widely accepted, thus shutting them out from those who should have accepted him, the white families which he had previously worked for. And I also found one thing quite amusing and kind of quite disgusting in the same sense, that when you were a good slave and you've basically worked and did everything that he told you to do, that gave you a good funeral. The funeral of Truth's fathers begged the quandary of good slave versus bad slave. The man who was beat, forced, told, and forcibly considered into manual labor was awarded what slave owners thought to be a fair and just funeral. And I say fair and just because one might initially assume that all slaves were returned to the dirt from which they came, left without proper burial or marker. However, Truth's father, whom the text cites as a kind and faithful slave, was nothing more than a modern day salt shoe. And I say this because he received a black coffin and spirits in addition to atone for his sins committed against slaves. Or the slave owners, one obliged the slave owners would give the other slaves who attended the funeral spirits, and they would paint the coffin black. And I say that they give them spirits, and I wouldn't say I say that I felt like they gave them spirits was more for their own conscience of how they treated the slaves and how they basically worked them, and now they just wanted to give them a good funeral because of how they felt towards that person. And I just felt like that this text, that Sojourner's narrative, was a resistance piece, because in this time no one had wrote about and exposed the things that the slaves in the North had to go through, like the living conditions and how they were beat, and how in some situations they were also raped, and just like the living conditions, and like one being another resistance piece is being like once you're no longer of value, or you're no longer once a youth, they just throw you away and don't give a damn about you, and just like let you go off and live once they've got all they can get out of you. And now I would like to move on to Baldwins Go Tell It on the Mountain. I just felt like this was, and I also kind of connected to this movie too, because throughout the whole story, John's dad wanted him to grow up in the church, but John didn't want to grow up in the church because that wasn't what he wanted to follow. And I kind of felt like this was a personal connection to me too, because I had an uncle who always wanted me to grow up in the church, and I didn't have any bad feelings toward the church or anything like that. But throughout that, I just felt like I just wanted to go a different path down, go down a different path in my life. But I always wanted to be spiritual, and I always wanted to give my honor to God, because without God I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't have the things that I have. But I felt like sometimes that it was being forced upon me, just like as it was being forced upon John in the movie. And I just feel like he really couldn't express himself because he didn't want to let his father down. And I also kind of found it quite amusing that his dad didn't accept him as the person that he wanted to be, because John wanted to be a writer, and his dad, I can remember one time John won an award from school, and he showed his dad the award that he received, but his dad told him, take it back, because this is just a white man trying to hold you down. And I kind of found that disgusting, because don't hold back this person from trying to go succeed and go be a great person in their future because of some things that happened in your past. And I also found it quite amusing that in the movie that in one of the scenes that they went to church at nighttime, and they didn't leave, and they didn't like disperse, into the morning, and I felt like I felt so strong, but behind this because at that in that time period, the African American community, sometimes the only place that they felt like they can only express themselves and not be judged for some of the things that they were saying or some of the ways that they were expressing themselves was in the church. So I felt like that if they were in the church and they were expressing themselves all night, that they wouldn't be judged. And I've just found that quite amusing because they had so much going on in the Harlem community, and some of the things that was going on with some of it was so passionate. They were so passionate about that was the only way that they could express themselves, and that was the only way that they could be heard was in the church. And they didn't care whether it took an hour or two or maybe 3 hours or sometimes maybe all night just to express themselves and some of the things that they had going on. And I just want to express one of the things about growing up in the South when John's father when Gabriel was growing up in the South, that sometimes people were scared to go out at nighttime. So it was basically hard being a African American man, or maybe not even just an African American man, because his Gabriel's sister and his future wife was also raped when they were going home at nighttime. So busy, so going home, so not going home, but being an African American out at nighttime was one of the hardest things to do. And I just feel like that this is why Gabriel was maybe so hard on John, because of some of the things that he personally had to endure during his life, and some of the things that he's seen in the South. And now being in Harlem, he had flashbacks all the time, and that this was one of the hardest things for him, one of the hardest times, and one of the hardest things for him to do, to live. So I kind of found that quite hard. Well, not hard, but I kind of found that quite amusing, and maybe one of the facts of why Gabriel was so hard on John, because he didn't want John to kind of, I guess, go down the same steps he did as himself. I would like to thank you guys for your time, and just thank you for listening to me.